For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to build a boat, and even better, not only do I get to build one, I get to build one now with my son. We spent years researching, months building. Today, we're at the point...
We recorded the whole thing up to this point. Let's just show them.
Okay, let's back up and let's show you how we got to this point.
Yeah, let's do that.
We caught a glimpse of the first sign of leaves changing at the shop, and we knew it was time to start the project. We had spent the last few months educating ourselves on boat building, and we settled on some plans from the 1950s from Glen L Design. It's called the mahogany, and it's a 5-person runabout boat. The boat construction starts with the frames. There's 4 frames that make the general shape of the boat. Starting with the rear, you have the transom, frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, and frame 4. Before we get into the fun of the frames, we have to build a building form, and this is a temporary structure that the boat is built on upside down. In my woodworking experience, I would also call this a jig because it sets all the forms exactly where they need to be and makes sure it maintains level. The building form is temporary, so we get to use 2x6s from our local lumber yard. We went with a combination of 16 and 12-foot lengths. Our first step was to establish a straight line for the boat, and Tommy wanted to get involved and had me a little worried about our productivity. This is Tom Silva, by the way. He's a shop cat. With the base member down, it was time for the lower spreaders. The reference lines allowed us to make sure we were installing them square to the base member. The upright legs are next, and they attach to the lower spreaders. By marking a line and then flipping it around, it showed Cameron clearly where the screws needed to go so it hit the center of the wood. With that part of the structure done, it's time to do that 2 more times, and we just make sure that it's square so that the frame will be sitting in the right place when the boat is constructed. The top of the frame needs to be absolutely level, and once we get it level, it's important that it doesn't move. So we're using Tapcon screws to actually anchor it into the floor. And a classic dad comment, that's not going anywhere. Now it's time to establish a straight line across the form, and to do that, I'm using a line laser, which makes it a lot easier than using a long level. This is called the setup members, and there's 2 of them, and this is what the frames will rest on. It's critical that they're straight and that they're installed absolutely level. Something I've realized as talking about this is that this is the only straight line on the boat. Everything else is curved or angled, arched, and this is the reference point that everything is built on. So it's critical that it's right. One-handed clamps come in handy to lock things into place but still allow for fine adjustments before everything is screwed in. Now, even though we were on the green line all the way around, I wanted to make sure that we were perfectly level from side to side and everything checked out okay. We locked this in with some screws so we didn't have movement, but we spent a lot of time, actually more time than we spent building this, making sure that everything was right and consistent from the left side to the right. It's just critical. Can't get this step wrong. Once we had it locked in with screws all the way around, we removed the clamps, and I felt like we had something accomplished. Next, we made some support brackets that weren't on the plans, but I feel like it makes the form a lot more rigid. And just like that, in one day, we have a building form, and it's time to build the frames. Well, actually, we're going to hold on building the frames. First, I want to do a layout board. And what the layout board will serve as will be a consistent mirror image of one side to the other. It's a place to assemble the frames and make sure that they're laid out consistently and that they're right. We have full-size templates of each frame that shows half of it, and we need to do a mirror copy image on the other side. There's a center line that Cameron's cutting out so we can match it up to the reference lines I just drew on the board. Now we have 2 reference marks on the center line for the frames. Our goal is to get the half template on one side copied over onto the other side so we're left with a full image of a frame, left and right side. I'm using 4-foot by 8-foot carbon paper to accomplish this, and I'll show you the process. I folded it in half so that the black ink side is on the bottom as well as facing up, and then I lined it up with the center line. I then placed the full-size template sheet on top of it and taped it down so it wouldn't move, lining up the center line holes that we made on the line on the board. I then proceeded to trace everything on the pattern, starting with a straight edge on the straight lines, and then I freehand the curved lines. Here I'm checking to see if it's transferring on the back side of the paper okay, and then I move on and just continue and keep tracing, and it's a slow process, but you try to get it as perfectly as possible. And this spot check was our first mistake of the boat build. You can see a double line on the flat straight one, and basically what that means is it crept a little on me while I was tracing it. So we just erased it because it was melamine and came off real easy, and this time we taped it on both sides to avoid that from happening. Here's the moment of truth. We take it off, we move the carbon paper over to the other half, and you can see the frame on the left-hand side. And now, because we had the carbon paper facing up, we have a reverse image on the back side of the plan that we can line up and then trace that side as well. Once we trace that side, remove the carbon paper, and we have our first layout of a full frame. We continued this process for all 4 frames in the transom, laying them out on this board. This will serve as the place that we assemble the frames once the parts are cut out. While Cameron was at school, I took the opportunity to run and get the mahogany for our frames. We're using 4/4, also known as 1-inch thick mahogany, and luckily I can get that locally, unlike some of the other materials. I went in here with a plan. I had all of my plans literally just to be able to reference. I was looking for straight grain, no knots, no voids, really choice pieces of wood, and it took a long time. A side note is I did get in trouble with the lumberyard. They told me I couldn't pick and choose as much as I was doing. Oh well. Now this is going to look just like the process before, but I promise you this is different. What I have here is a 1/2-inch piece of Baltic birch plywood, and it's going to be used to make the templates. And when I say templates, I mean breaking these parts down into their individual components. We regularly lifted the carbon paper to make sure we were getting a good transfer of the design, and Tommy just kept gracing us with his presence. This tracing process was very time consuming, but again, just like everything else, it's important. Now it's time for the reveal, and we almost got it just right, but here's a surprise we found right here. 2 parts overlapping each other. No big deal, we'll just have to retrace that part, but other than that, we have a lot of the parts for the frame completed. So I went straight into cutting out the rough sizes with the track saw, and this saved a huge amount of time. The idea is that once I get these cut out, I was going to hand them over to Cameron to cut on the bandsaw. And I don't know of any way faster than doing it this way. It just worked out great. I put a piece of cardboard underneath it and overcut it just a little bit, and then I finished up some of them using the miter saw. Meanwhile, Cameron was cutting out the parts close to the line on the bandsaw. By cutting just outside the line, he could finish it up and make it perfect on the sander. The side template pieces are complete, but on the bottom, it's actually only half of it. So this is the method that I came up with to duplicate the bottom part of the frame. I basically laid it on a flat line, traced the part, and then I flipped it over and did it on the other side and just made sure I had a perfectly straight line. By tracing each one of the same half pieces, I'm guaranteed that both sides are identical. And it came out pretty nice. Back to the track saw to quickly cut out the rough shape of the long template for the bottom of the frame so that I can hand it off to Cameron just like we did before. And we're getting really close to touching some mahogany really soon, so stay with me. I just needed to make the longer version of the base templates, and we're ready to trace on mahogany. The short pieces shown here are the sides, and we need 2 of each one. After tracing, I cut them roughly out to length on the miter saw. The idea is we'll cut out the pieces at exactly the same time, so the left and right side will match exactly. And the way we do this is to use double stick tape on a stack of both the pieces underneath it. And we way underestimated the power of this double stick tape the first time we used it. I laughed looking at this, at how much we put on there the first trial. We had trouble getting this off using this much. I'll put a link in the description to this tape, but it's something we bought on Amazon, and it is unbelievably strong. It does a great job holding. After Cameron made his first mahogany and plywood sandwich, he placed it on the bandsaw and he cut just outside the line using the same method we used for the template. And now, after all of those cutouts are completed, we're finally cutting actual mahogany boat parts out. And the way we're doing this is a ball bearing flush trim bit, and we have it placed on the original template, and it's just cutting both of the mahogany pieces at the exact same time. It does a great job. This was a 2-bit set. It's a helical head. It has a ball bearing at the top and the bottom. It came in a set of 2. I'll be sure to include a link in the description for this router bit set. Okay, I got a little off track with the router bit. You can tell I got excited about it, but this is where we started finding out how strong that double stick tape was. It really did a great job at holding it, and I had complete confidence when we were at the router table that it was not going to let go. So we continued with 2 small pieces now and not 1 long strip. We learned the hard way, and it does everything it needs to do, holding it no matter what kind of operation we performed. It seemed to hold great. This method is a little time consuming, but it's the only way to ensure both parts are identical in every way and you have absolute symmetry. And here it is, a sneak peek. I actually had to use my pen nailer. I couldn't wait. Just wanted to see what they look like. This is just laid out on top of the table, but we're starting to have what looks like frames. Next up was an unexpected road trip. We used marine plywood for the gussets and other parts of the boat. Marine plywood does not have voids and it bends easier than conventional plywood. The issue is that no one in Kentucky stocks marine plywood, and the closest place we found was Sandusky, Ohio, which is about 400 miles away from us. So we did a road trip and drove where we thought was in the middle of nowhere. We came across this place called Homestead Hardwoods, which apparently specializes in the boat building trade. I also picked up from just looking around in the store that they also built bats for, it looks like the Cincinnati Reds, and they go way back to like the 50s. So it's a place with a lot of history, and you can tell by the way they still write their sales on paper. But it's a great place to find a lot of different types of hardwoods. So he had us back up to their other building, which had all of their plywood stored. And then at the same time, if you want to buy a horse, apparently you can buy one of those as well. This guy knew his way around the forklift, and he quickly uncovered the plywood we were looking for. We are loading up Douglas fir marine plywood in 3/4, ½ inch, 3/8, and 1/4 inch thicknesses. For the transom, I needed a 3/4 piece of mahogany, and this was the diamond, the most expensive piece that we picked up. And if anyone ever doubts that it's marine plywood, we have a stamp to prove it. With the van loaded up, we said bye to Mr. Horse, and we headed out back towards Kentucky. 400 miles back to the shop. Now it's time to make the stem, the chine, and the breast hook. My daughter stopped by the shop, which was a nice treat, and she helped me with the carbon tracing method that we used on the other template parts. The stem is made from 3/4 inch Douglas fir marine plywood, and it's doubled up for strength, so I needed to cut 2 of them out. So I just used my Festool cis clamp and a jigsaw, and I cut them out as close to the line as possible, and I just married up the stems together and final sand them to clean it up. And just like that, I have a finished stem, and I also laid it out on the table to see what it looks like. That's the front of a boat. Because these are one-off pieces and not mirrored images of each other, I was able to trace directly onto the Douglas fir plywood, eliminating the need for a template. I pulled back the carbon paper and verified I had a good imprint on the plywood, and then followed the same process just in time for Cameron to get out of school and start cutting frame gussets. Let's talk about what frame gussets are. They're a 3/8 inch plywood that covers the mahogany frame for reinforcement. Because they have mirror images of each other, we use the same templating method to cut both of the gussets for each frame at the same time. Before removing the template, we used it to identify the spots we wanted to pre-drill for the nails or screws that will be used in the frame in the upcoming assembly process. We were then able to remove the template off, and we had to actually use this twice because there's 4 gussets for each frame. This is where the full-size layout board that we made in the beginning of the process really comes in handy. To assemble the frames, I just lay each one of them out over it, and in this case, I'm using it to mark the notch locations for the bottom. This is where the bottom battens will be installed, and the jigsaw made quick work of cutting out these notches that don't have to be perfect because they're going to be filled with epoxy anyway. A little pre-assembly on the bench, and we're getting these frames knocked out. Probably wasn't a good idea to do this one first, but I've double checked and checked it. I have the layout on the white board. I'm using my square to make sure that I'm centered right here all the way up, and I'll have to come back and route out the actual grooves on here. But this frame is glued up and looks good. With the frames completed, it's time to finally install them on the building form that we built earlier in the process. And I took the time to make sure that we were still completely plumb level, because this is what's going to set the locations of the frames and the permanent location once we start connecting them together. Not only is it important that they're sitting completely flat and level, it's also important that they're in line with each other from the front of the boat to the back. So to do that, we installed some white screws and we used our line laser and set it in the front and just set a line down the middle that just followed the whole thing to make sure that it was all in line all the way down. This process worked out really nicely. We could have used a string, but the laser just really helped us dial it in. We actually ended up bringing in 2 lasers and set one a 1/4 inch off so we could truly see exactly where it falls, because it's hard to see a laser in the up in the midair, so we would set it just a 1/4 inch off on center to be able to tell that we were there. From there, Cameron locked in each one of the frames with 2 screws, and then it was on to the next step. The first thing that we're going to do to tie these frames together is to start construct the keel, which is the middle bottom of the boat. And this is made up of a sandwich of 1/4 inch marine plywood, followed by solid mahogany that faces the bottom side of the boat. The keel requires a piece of mahogany longer than I can source out, so I'm going to be using a scarf joint, and I'm going to overlap the joints so that it's super strong, including the plywood layer underneath it. So it was on to mixing a batch of epoxy, and Cameron helped me get it into the assembly, and we got it all in clamps so that it could be ready for installation. Next, I moved on to the breast hook assembly, the finishing of that, and the track saw really came in handy here for doing this double compound angle. Made it so easy. Next, we concentrated on the stem and assembled that with epoxy and bronze screws. It's a triple piece of the same thing, and you can see here how it fits on the front. All right, I think we finally have this form and the frame locked in all together. And this one was a tricky part. The stem basically floats and you have to do blocking to make it in the right position. This way, where it's a straight line, but also up and down. And something that really came in handy was this laser going along the top of the form. And it actually, that pattern carries on over to here. And there's actually a dimension on here that says 21 5/8 from the top of the form to the bottom of the stem, the breast hook. So if I just now checked and I put my tape measure on there and I look, it says exactly 21 5/8 from the bottom to the top on my laser. So I at least know we're on the right track for before we do the rest of the work. We're not going to do a lot of fairing. This is straight and this is in the right place. So tomorrow we're going to start on the keel, the board that goes all the way back. Can't wait to get it. We've got it in clamps right now and we'll be installing that tomorrow. We pulled the keel out of the clamps, and one of the things that specifies in the original plans was to put a bronze ring shank nail in every 6 inches down the whole entire keel. And because we put it together with epoxy and clamps, this probably is overkill, but we went ahead and did it anyway. And it was a pain because the bronze nails are so soft, they're really, really easy to just fold over. Cameron did not enjoy this job, but he did do it on the floor where there was no give, and it made it a little bit easier. Went all the way down the entire keel following this process. Then we were able to set the keel in place for the first time, and it set very nicely. And the first step was to do a slight bevel on the front side where it matches up with the stem. This will make it easier when fairing. Here you can see how that angle fits into the stem and is going to save a lot of fairing for us once we start getting this shaped out. After connecting it and making sure that the length was right, we mixed up another batch of epoxy and went ahead and put it on every one of the frames all the way back to the transom. And then we got that installed, put it on with clamps. Next, we moved into, while the epoxy was still wet, we wanted to put the long bronze screws in each one of the frame members. We countersunk them. Cameron and I used 2 drills. He did the pre-drill, and then we sank the screws. Worked pretty nicely. We went down the whole frame while the epoxy was still curing, so we knew it was locked down tight. The upper portion of the boat, when it's upright along the edges, is called the shear, and the lower section is called the chine. And that's what we're doing next. And I'm super excited at this step because this is what's going to give the boat its shape. You're going to be able to see the upper curvature of the boat, and you're going to be able to see the lower side curvature of the boat. Something that's an ongoing trend is that you cannot get mahogany wood that's the length required for this, which I'm thinking was around 21 feet is what I needed to do the curvature. So the scarf joint is the only way to make that happen. And I basically went with the formula of a 1 foot cut at an angle, and that gets epoxied, and they say that that type of joint is as strong as the wood itself. So we went ahead and mixed up a big batch of epoxy and did all the wood for the shear, shear, not cheer, and then also the chine. By doing all of these at the same time, it really speeds up the process. Following day, Cameron and I removed all of the clamps from our now 20-foot long boards, and we went outside with our planer because we needed 20 feet in front and behind the planer for in-feed, out-feed. So it made sense just to take it outside. And it was cold and uncomfortable, but we managed to plane them all down to 1/2 inch thick because we're going to be bending these and we're going to laminate them. Here you can see the bend. We're using a tape measure to kind of check it out. And the notches in the frame have to be done now because they're done at an angle. As you can see, the angle doesn't fall even though it's notched. So I used the jigsaw with a long blade first to get a rough estimate of the angle that we were going to need on each one of the frame members, and this worked out fairly nicely. You could also use a reciprocating saw or even a hand saw, but we're trying to get this part done quickly, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be close enough that it maintains the angle, and we're going to use epoxy and fillers to really get this thing locked into place. You can see how thin the material is that we're bending, and this turned out to be a very good decision because this was an angle more than I even imagined once we started bending it in place. You're at the point where you can almost hear some cracking. So I can't imagine doing this in one piece, which some people on the forums have done that. I would highly advise using 2 pieces for sure. With both the chines in place, it was a good time to check and see if we were still sitting perfectly level, because this is what sets the bottom side of each side of the boat, and this is something you can't go back from. So we spent a lot of time making sure that this all looked right and all the measurements were the same and we had a symmetrical boat. Once we were good with all of our measurements, we countersunk and drove bronze screws into each frame member so that we could start with the second layer. And you can see now how the lamination gives us our width that we needed, but allowed us to bend it a little bit easier. After attaching the second layer to the transom on the back, I just pull it around and just basically eye that angle and mark it and cut it by hand. And I used a Japanese pull saw which could just match the angle, and you can see I purposely cut it long, and then I just use a hand plane to keep getting it closer and closer to that angle and that edge on the stem. This was a good time to start a little bit of the fairing because the front of the stem needs to be angled on both sides, and for me to be able to tell exactly where that chine falls, I had to angle both sides. So I went ahead and worked on this part. Because of the amount of pressure that these will be under, before I put the epoxy and laminated these together, I went ahead and pre-drilled and actually put the screws in place to make it easier for when the wet epoxy was going to be on the layer. Now it's time for a glue up. I removed the top layer and I mixed up a batch of epoxy that was about the thickness of peanut butter. I used regular epoxy with adhesive fillers, and then now that I have my screw holes to go by, I was able to lock it right into place and get it all back into place before the epoxy had time to cure. There's phases of the boat construction that make you feel like you're flying and have it made, and then there's others where you're struggling and not sure you're going to be able to do it. This is definitely one of the times that I thought we've got this nailed and we're getting ready to knock out the shear as fast as we did the chine. Little did we know it was going to be much more challenging, and we knocked the easiest one out first. It's Saturday morning at the shop, and Cameron and I have a plan. We're going to install the shear clamp, go to lunch. It's going to be an easy day. We've already got the shear made. All we have to do is the same process. We were feeling like master boat builders and thought, hey, we'll slap this on real fast, go to lunch, and then glue the epoxy on the second layer when we get back. But this is where things started turning bad. It snapped.
Why did we have no trouble with that one?
So we spent 4 hours making a new 20-foot board for the one that we broke. Shear clamp attempt, take 2. I still remember plainly that Cameron said he wanted me to be the one to break it, so he got on the back end of the board. I was a little nervous, but I felt good about it because we managed to do it on the other side, and it looked like the grain was really nice and straight with no voids, and that becomes really important when you're bending it under pressure. So this is the part where it snapped once we get this screw in there, and we're holding our breath. And success. It held and no snapping. Yay! Next up, it's time to mix another batch of epoxy, and I'm turning into an epoxy mixing machine. I cannot stress the importance of learning about epoxy and stocking up, because we definitely are going through it. This was a very awkward gluing situation. I made sure I made it extra thick, like peanut butter consistency with all the fillers, but it still was working upside down, and Cameron helped me hold it in place while we locked it back in with the original screw holes. It felt so good to start getting this one locked into place, because I knew once we had this, we had the actual basic structure of the boat, the shape of the boat, and felt like a big milestone was getting to be ahead of us. Next up was to refine our notches on our frames to prepare for the battens, which are on the bottom of the boat that run from the transom to the front. Next up was getting 2 long holes through the stem and keel to tie them together. We used 8-inch long carriage bolts with locking nuts on both sides. You can imagine the amount of stress and strain that happens on this joint being on the front of the boat, so it's really important that it's tied together tightly.
What I'm doing currently is using a flexible stick
to check how it flexes and making sure there's no gaps before this frame stuck out, and it was proud of the chine log and the shear, and now there's this perfectly smooth transition so that we put skin on this boat, there won't be any gaps. We've had to continue that on down, have to check every step of the way to make sure that there is a smooth transition from there to there with no gaps. This is time consuming, but I'm really hoping with Cameron coming after school that we should be able to get this part of the process knocked out by the end of the week. That's aggressive, but we'll see what we can do. Haha. Yeah, it wasn't by the end of the week. I would estimate it to be about 2.5 weeks that Cameron and I spent on fairing. I worked on it some by myself. He would work on it after school. We worked on it together. The front part of the bow requires such aggressive fairing that I ended up trying out my Festool restoration grinder with a head on it. It's the equivalent of, I would say, like 15 grit sandpaper. And taking it nice and easy, this saved a ton of time to get the rough shape on the shear clamp. Because if you look at that curve on the front, when you're done with the angle on it, it's a triangle shaped board. So there's so much that has to come off from it. So by using this restoration grinder, it saved a lot of time that we were able to come back with a hand plane and fine tune it. But this removes a lot of material really fast. And you got to be careful not to remove too much. It's tempting to just keep on going. But here you can see that basically how I'm turning the shear into a triangle on the front so it can match the angle. We added a Tormek to our shop for sharpening, and timing couldn't be more perfect. Our friend Sedge set us up with the right training and got Cameron up to speed on how to use this strop and how to make it razor sharp. And can't stress the importance of having a good sharpening method, because we would dull the planes in a matter of 20-30 minutes. It was time to sharpen them again with all of the planing that we were doing and bearing, and it just seemed like a process that was never going to end. Really helps to have two people. You can see here how Cameron's finalizing that shape. There's nothing square. That's why the forms are so important. Everything else is curved and rounded, and you learn that really quickly. And it was a lot of really good practice for us with hand tools. We're not big hand tool people, but I see the advantage of using hand planes because you can take off pretty aggressively, but not too aggressive. And we just really started becoming comfortable with it, as you can see. The entire keel is actually angled on both sides. So we put a center line and just kept finding it over so there's a nice shape of each side with a center point. And this had to be done down the entire boat as well as where it meets the stem. There's just a lot of fairing that goes into getting this ready for the skin.
Be sure to check out our next video
Where we skin it
we finish it.
and we attempt to flip it.